Welcome to Mac Talk, a Middle Tennessee podcast from Monthaven Arts and Cultural Center in Hendersonville, Tennessee. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at the Centerpoint Wine and Liquor Store in Hendersonville. I'm your announcer, Jim Black. When you think about old places, what comes to mind? Perhaps you think about the pyramids of Egypt or the Parthenon in Greece. Or maybe, if you're from these parts, you think about the Parthenon in Nashville's Centennial Park. In truth, most of us probably think about old places in our own hometowns. We think about an old courthouse or an old family church. We think about the places we have always known. Old places really matter to us. Why? Our guest today is an expert in this subject. His name is Thompson Mayes, Vice President and Senior Counsel at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He's also the author of a terrific book titled Why Old Places Matter. He's here today to speak with MAC's Chief Operating Officer, John Pitcher. He's going to speak about the extraordinary appeal of old places. John, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And Tom, welcome to Mac Talk. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, your book resonated with me before I even opened it, even opened the cover, because you have a picture on the cover of Union Station. I grew up in Arlington, Virginia. I went to high school at Gonzaga High School on North Capitol Street. So 4 years of my life was spent going to and from Union Station in Washington, D.C. So once I did open up the book, I saw immediately, okay, I could start checking things off. This was this old place here in Washington. Checked off my personal identity side, my sense of civic identity, because everything in Washington sort of calls to mind some kind of civic identity. And I'm just wondering why old places matter. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, John, thank you first for noting Union Station on the cover. I chose it because it did resonate with so many of the reasons that old places matter to people. Not only the ones that you mentioned, but just the idea of grand architecture. It's a wonderful landmark. People do have personal memories associated with it. Lots of people have those associations. There's a sense of collective identity around it, as you identified. So it really is a great example of an old place that matters to lots of people for lots of different reasons. It also is a place where the National Trust has worked to help save it over the years. You know, it's been threatened any number of times. So it's a great example. On the question of why I was interested in this, I had taught historic preservation law at the University of Maryland for many years, and I would begin every class with a question about why we have historic preservation law. And very quickly the conversation would turn into why we have historic preservation at all. And the reasons that are cited in our laws and in our policies around historic preservation, saving our heritage, property values, economic development, while important, didn't seem to get to the deeply held feeling that people seem to have around the old places of their lives. So I decided to explore that and to try to think through the reasons that places really do matter to people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I noticed in your biography, you work at the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Washington. You have an undergraduate degree in history, a law degree, and both from Chapel Hill, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. You have a writing degree from Johns Hopkins. So it struck me that, you have uniquely found a way in what you're doing now to sort of tie all of those things together. What got you interested in historic preservation, though, as a career? That's what you do.
I became interested in historic preservation. Tell you the truth, I don't remember when I wasn't interested in it. Even when I was a kid, I would ask my parents and my older siblings who had a driver's license to drive me to old places that I would find out about. And I grew up in the country outside of Charlotte, what was then the country. There were still a lot of abandoned old farmhouses, some of which were being used as barns. My parents often knew the people who owned them, so they would get permission for me to go into these places. Sometimes I would just sneak into the places, and they always drew me for some reason. And so I don't know that I've ever not been interested in historic preservation. I didn't know that's what it was called then. Mm-hmm. I just was an old house nut.
Okay, that's a good answer. And speaking of old things, do you have a favorite old place, just personally?
A favorite old place. There are so many, and of course it's very dangerous to talk about your favorite old place because there's so many places I love. But a place that's in the book that I think about as being one of my favorite places that people can visit is a place in Mendocino, California called the Quan Tai Temple. And it is a Taoist temple that was built in California in the 1850s.
Okay.
Looks just like a Western storefront, like you would see in a movie, except it's painted green and red, and inside is a temple. And of course, it's a wonderful place. And one of the descendants of the families that built it said, one of the things that's great about the fact that this place still survives is it reminds people that we, the Chinese Americans, were here. Mm-hmm. And you don't think of that as a part of Western history all the time. And it's so critically important. So I'll just cite that as an example, but there are many places I love.
Okay. Your book, it's an excellent book, Why Old Places Matter. It's published by Roman and Littlefield. Consists of 14 essays, which I believe you wrote first before you compiled them all into a book. What I love about them is that you can read and reread them in almost any order. It's not necessarily an arc, although they're all connected. And I believe I heard you say in some of the YouTube videos I watched that you were looking to spur conversations about why old places matter. What sort of conversations do you think we should be having about old places?
What an excellent question. One of the things that's interesting about having published the book so that it's sort of in this static form is it doesn't necessarily invite the conversations that I want people to have. I think there is many reasons that old places matter, as there are relationships between people and places. So people continually tell me new words that are not in the book. And some of the ones that have really resonated with me are the word belonging, that old places give people a sense of belonging. One lady talked about comfort, that particularly after tragic events, old places can give people a sense of comfort. And I think increasingly in America, the idea of our identity is, which I do talk about in the book, is increasingly important. And the places that we choose to value and recognize and preserve reflect who we are as a people. So I'm not... I certainly think that our work, the National Trust work in programs like the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which helps bring to the fore places that have not been represented in historic preservation, is critically important work that helps to change our sense of national identity and our sense of collective identity. So I think that that work is essential as we think about the places that we should value and that we should save. And I'll say, I don't think that work has ever been more important. It is right at the heart of our identity as people, and is critically important that we have those conversations and pursue that work.
Mm-hmm. And of course, our identity over time changes too, right? So our interpretations of these old places and how they define us can change with them.
That's exactly right. I was just at Rock Castle and meeting with the executive director, Sam, who kindly took me on a visit. And he talked about the layering of history there and the importance of the acknowledgement of the Cherokee presence on the land and the relationship of the builder of that house with the Cherokee people. He was fluent in the Cherokee language. And then with the people who were enslaved on that plantation and their descendants, and the importance of recognizing that history.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I want to get a little bit more into that in a moment. We met, speaking of plantations, at Monthaven, a little while ago. And that was a house, an antebellum home. I believe it was built probably around or completed around 1856, 1858. It served as a hospital, a field hospital during the Civil War. It's a glorious old place, but we have, rather than trying to simply turn it into a monument to that time, we have actually used it as a jumping off point. We embrace it, but we have turned it into an art museum and a place where we do a lot of outreach to underserved communities, and especially to military veterans with our healing arts program. It just seemed logical to us, if this was a place that was so steeped in the military history of this region at one time, how do we handle that today? And our sense was, well, let's handle it creatively. Let's take this old place and use it as inspiration for something new. And you write, I think, very eloquently about creativity in your book as one of the reasons that old places matter, is they help us be creative. That's very important to us here in the Nashville area. You open by making a reference to the great urbanologist Richard Florida, who wrote The Rise of the Creative Class. And of course, Richard has a wonderful section in there that he refers to as the Nashville effect. Because, when you have old places, like in the case of Nashville, places like Ryman Auditorium or Studio A, where Elvis and these people, used to record, where Ben Folds now records, it attracts other creatives and really inspires other creativity. Why do you think that old places do that? Why are they so much better, perhaps, or maybe not better, but they seem to be very good at inspiring our creative senses?
The old places, well, first of all, thanks for mentioning RCA Studio A. I love the fact that it has been preserved really as a place to continue an artistic legacy. And I'm so grateful to Ben Folds for his work to do that. There are a lot of people who write about this connection between creativity and old places, and I firmly believe that it's there. I mean, there is the idea of the artistic legacies and how they continue. But the things that you mentioned, like the way Monthaven has a military history and a military hospital history, and how important that is for present day people, and for the healing that can come out of that, is incredibly important. There is one study that was done to try to distinguish between the difference between a new place and an old place. This person tried to match the places as much as possible. So he used a new urbanist community outside of Charleston, South Carolina, and contrasted it with the historic district of Charleston. And what came out of that study was that people's imaginations were spurred more by the old places than they were by the new place. And Part of that was they would spontaneously fantasize about past lives, about the way people might have inhabited these places. And something about that age and about the imagination looking at a building, the way old places can be quirky or unusual, raises questions in people's minds and seems to spur their imaginations in a certain way. So I'm not sure we know the answer to it, but I think many artists and writers and everyday people who feel a sense of creativity do feel inspired by old places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We were just mentioning that Monthaven at one time, during the Civil War, had been used as a field hospital. A few years back, there was a lot of controversy in the country about Confederate monuments. There was a particularly big controversy about a Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville. That got me thinking a little bit because, I mentioned that my family were the Calverts from Maryland and Virginia. My great-grandfather's name was Lee Calvert. He was named after this Confederate general. That was just considered normal in those days. And I thought, I'm not a student of the Civil War. Why don't I do a little bit more research myself? Because my father was a historian. So I grabbed an old biography of Robert E. Lee from his shelf. It was written by an old Virginian named Clifford Doughty. He was born in the early 1900s. He published this book in the mid-1960s. He was very renowned for his knowledge of the battlefields, so I could get at least that much out of it. So I started reading this biography on Robert E. Lee, and he told us right up front, if you want to understand Robert E. Lee, his motivations, you have to understand the land. This was a man who was connected to the land. His family, the Lees and the Carters, were instrumental in the early part of the colony in setting up the agricultural system there. That's where the money came from. In Virginia was a big engine of economics in the early colonial period. One thing that struck me, though, about this biography, that, okay, these families were instrumental in setting up this plantation system. Clifford Doughty, and this was in the 1960s, doesn't mention the word slave at all in the first 50 pages of this book. I think here and there might be a reference to household servants, but there's no reference to this. And I started thinking back about that biography when I read your chapter on civic identity, because I think you kind of allude to the fact that sometimes our stories on old places, they don't tell everybody's stories. And, times change, and we do need to think about that. And so I'm wondering, how do we address that issue here in this day and age?
What a fantastic question. The truth of the matter is that, the field of preservation has not always told all the stories. And we at the National Trust think it's incredibly important to tell the full American story and to bring to the fore stories that have been underrepresented or haven't been told. And it is deeply affirming for people. In the book, I talk about the experience of Dorothy Sproul Redford, who was one of the first people at historic sites, in this case a historic site in North Carolina called Somerset Place, to begin to gather the descendants of the enslaved people who worked on that plantation. And there's a quote in there, I won't be able to get it directly right, but basically she says, being able to be at that place was deeply, deeply meaningful to her, and more meaningful than all the documents she had studied about her family history. So the connections that the descendants of the formerly enslaved people have are equally important, but have never been told necessarily. And they are beginning to be told now. And it's critically important that they do. One of the great things about old places, though, is that because of their particular histories and their individualized histories. It allows individual stories to come forward. And the fact that the place continues to exist allows those stories to continue to exist. So it's vitally important that we not only save and reuse these places, whether for an art center or for a museum or for a private home, but also that we embrace the opportunity to tell the more complete history and the more complete story of the American experience.
Mm-hmm. Some of those stories really are fascinating. And in fact, I know Monthaven in the past, of course, an old place, it's very typically has told part of the story. The people who came before us have done a lot of research. I have been inspired by your book and other books like this to do some more research, and we're working on that right now. There were enslaved people at Monthaven, and we do know that many of them stayed in the area after the war. There is a road located about a quarter of a mile from Monthaven called Free Hill Road, and that's where a lot of them relocated. So we are in the process right now of trying to research and see if we can get their stories and their pictures and their names, and I think it'll create a richer texture of narrative. So I find it very, very inspiring, what you wrote about here.
That's wonderful. The National Trust worked with a number of partners to develop a rubric for engagement with the descendants of the enslaved people. And I would encourage people to take a look at that.
Oh, I'll definitely do that.
It's really just so essential that those stories come forward, and that the oral histories that still continue to exist can be recorded now.
Yeah. I think people will be surprised at how stories like that actually tend to bring us more together than the opposite. Well, I want to read a quote from your book. This is a extremely well-documented book. There was one quote, though, from President Kennedy that I found to be especially powerful, and not surprisingly from President Kennedy, but Kennedy wrote, "I look forward to an America which will not be afraid of grace and beauty, which will protect the beauty of our natural environment, which will preserve the great old American houses and squares and parks of our national past, and which will build handsome and balanced cities for our future." I thought that's in your chapter here on beauty, and I'm just wondering, are we still afraid of beauty? And what makes old places beautiful?
Another great question. Are we afraid of beauty? I think people are afraid to use the word beauty. I think they find it embarrassing to say, and I think they're worried about being accused of being frivolous or not serious. And yet, beauty is something that is deeply moving to people, and it inspires them and gives comfort to their everyday lives. I'm a believer in everyday beauty, and old places provide that sense of beauty. It's worth remembering that the preservation movement was started in part by artists who were inspired to save the places that they wanted to either paint or draw or work in or live in. So beauty has always been at the heart of historic preservation. There is something else, though, which is the idea that beautiful places can help people develop a sense of empathy with others, that it opens people's minds and hearts in a way that after experiencing beauty, they feel more empathetic towards others. And there's a wonderful book by a woman named Elaine Scarry on, I think it's called On Beauty and Justice. And it's a great book. And I think old places that people enjoy often help contribute to that sense of beauty in our communities. Personally, I also find that the factor of age gives them a sense of beauty. And sometimes that's difficult for people to see. but it's a factor in how we look at these old places in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe you mentioned that some things that people might consider beautiful in the ancient world might be ruins. So, I mean, not exactly, something, architecturally polished and finished by today's standards, just, an old piece of granite that's broken off. But there's maybe because artists are among the people who seem to be so attracted to old places, it sparks their imaginations of what was and what could be.
Absolutely. And ruins, of course, reflect that old idea of the sublime, of something that's both, awful and beautiful at the same time. And it also, one of the words I did not use in the book, but that I'm continuing to explore, is the experience of awe. And people do have a sense of awe when they're in old places. Just the age itself can give people a sense of awe where they come away from that again with this experience of something that's outside their normal lives that helps them perhaps be more thoughtful and feel expanded in their sense of self.
Right. Well, and if not awe, maybe sacred. And you mentioned that in your book as well. They make some people feel like, they look at an old cathedral or something, and religious people will maybe see the presence of God in this. Non-religious people, though, are equally moved, or often equally moved, because they maybe don't see the presence of God, but they see something that's maybe peaceful. So why are old places, why do they sometimes give us this sense of the sacred?
Old places have a couple different senses of sacred, as you alluded to. The first is the religious sense of the sacred, and many people do go on pilgrimages to see old places that have religious meaning to them. In the book, I talk about a place in New Mexico called the Sanctuario de Chimayo, which was considered a healing place. And when I went there, was deeply moved by the place and by the aluminum crutches hanging on the wall of people who felt like they had been healed there, by the sense of flickering candles, by the smell of incense, by the quietness and reverence of people that are there. So there certainly is that sense of religion and the sacredness of religion, and that can cross different religious faiths. We see that with the way places like Mount Taylor are revered by Native American tribes or other sacred places. But there's also just the sense of places that are hallowed by the things that happen there. You talked about Monthaven having been a Civil War hospital, and undoubtedly people suffered there and died there. In a sense, it is a place that's sanctified by the painful things that happen there, both its history of slavery, but also the history of pain and death and trauma from war. So places can also be sanctified and considered sacred by that, by those difficult histories. And I think people visiting those places, particularly if they know those stories, can have a sense of that hallowed ground, that sacredness.
Okay. I was pleased to see in your book that old places can help us be sustainable. And I believe that the National Trust has or as a kind of a green lab or something. Could you talk a little bit about the sustainability of old places?
Great, of course. I don't think that the full power of old places to serve as a green strategy and a sustainability strategy going forward has been fully recognized. The preservation and reuse of existing buildings and older buildings is critically important if we're to work our way out of reliance on fossil fuel. And there are a couple ways this is true. First, old places are already existing. So they're not, if the reuse of an old place doesn't use green fields, it doesn't destroy habitat, it doesn't destroy green space. So there's that at the outset. Next, those places are already built. So all the carbon footprint that went into building that place to begin with, whether it's the extraction of stone, the making of brick, the cutting of wood, the transportation of all of that material to the site, and the construction of it, that represents embodied carbon. Mm-hmm. And the reuse of those buildings preserves that embodied carbon and keeps it in place, rather than having to go build new places and repeat that extraction and use of carbon. There's also simply the green strategies that exist in historic buildings to begin with, whether it's the use of clear story windows for light, or an example I use is the shutters on my home church, which are still used for hurricane protection. All of those heating and cooling and protection and light strategies are present in old buildings. We are, you mentioned the Preservation Green Lab. The Preservation Green Lab published something called The Greenest Building, and it is a study of the carbon savings and carbon impact of preserving buildings versus tearing them down and building new. And it found that it takes 10 to 80 years for a new building that is 30% more carbon effective than an existing building. It takes 10 to 80 years for a new building to recover the construction cost and the carbon construction cost that goes into that new building. So it is very important that we begin to recognize that simply reusing buildings is a green strategy. Happily, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is coming out from the EPA now, has recognized the rehabilitation of older buildings as one of the things that will contribute to a sustainable future. So we're grateful for that and looking forward to continuing to work on this.
Okay. Well, really just one more question. I appreciate your taking so much time with us. This series of essays, this book, I believe began with a fellowship to Rome. So you've been working on this you have been thinking about this and working on these ideas for a while. In writing these essays and doing all this research, it's very well documented. Is there anything about your work here, your thinking about this, that really surprised you at the end of it when you put these essays together? Was there something about old places, a benefit of them, or something that you had just never dawned on you? It was just, and it was perhaps eye-opening.
That's an excellent question, and I'm not sure anyone's ever asked me that question before, but I have three immediate thoughts. The first is, I had been a lifelong preservationist, and I came away from writing this book thinking, oh my gosh, old places are way more important than I thought they were. They're important for far more reasons to more people. They're just deeply important to our lives, both as communities and as individuals. And they're also solutions to some of our worldwide problems today. So that was probably the most fundamental surprise I had. I was also a little bit surprised at this connection to creativity, because I had not thought about that very much. And frankly, I wrote that essay simply because I was interested in the topic. And I discovered that there is a deeper connection to creativity than I had imagined. And lastly, probably the most surprising thing was people began to care about these places in about one generation. So I include in the book a reference to the mall of my junior high school years, which, while I was in Rome, its demolition was approved. And to my surprise, a preservation group sprang up to try to save Eastland Mall in Charlotte. And I really had to ponder what that was about. And I came away realizing that people can form attachments and memories with places in about a generation, about 30 or 40 years, which also happens to be the time frame when these buildings are most vulnerable. So you'll see as we're trying to save wave after wave of buildings, now we're talking about brutalist buildings built in the 60s and 70s, which people now have a sense of connection to. So that was a real surprise for me. But fundamentally, it's this idea that, wow, old places are way more important than I even thought they were.
Okay. Thompson Mayes is the Vice President and Counsel at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and he has written an amazing book, Why Old Places Matter. It's something that I think will resonate with everyone. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, John. A pleasure to be with you.
You've been listening to Mac Talk, a Middle Tennessee podcast from Monthaven Arts and Cultural Center in Hendersonville. Today's episode was brought to you by Centerpoint Wines and Liquors. Our guest today was Tom Mayes, Vice President, Senior Counsel at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. For more information about the Trust, please visit their website, savingplaces.org. Our podcast music was written by Nashville composer Christina Spinay. Our producer is Jonah Pitcher. I'm your announcer, Jim Black, and we'll see you next time.